I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Why is it that somebody chooses to start a religion? You know, our world is often measured by the religion of any collective population. Somebody who comes from America, probably a Christian. From Saudi Arabia, a Muslim. From India, a Hindu. From Utah, a Mormon. Nearly infinite historical factors play into why this is the case, but the root of those factors is so often one guy, yes, guy, who says, I'm going to start a religion. Most world religions are so disconnected from their founders by time and lack of documentation, so Mormonism presents a fascinating case study in this regard. Not only is the founder of Mormonism well studied, but we have thousands of documents which shed light on his decision-making processes. We have newspapers and books from the time and place where this religious leader grew up, and we can watch how societal elements factored into Joe's burgeoning religion. We have affidavits and interviews with his neighbors, both friends and enemies. We have membership records of certain people joining the church at certain times who influenced the direction of Joe's religion in one way or another. We have birth, marriage, and death certificates of thousands of Joe's early followers. We have a reminiscence from Joe's own mother written soon after his death, providing a unique and unvarnished account of the Smith family dynamics. We have thousands of letters written by the hands of these early saints, along with hundreds of journals, giving historians a window into the past, unmatched by basically any other world religion. A lot of people wonder if Christianity would be a thing today if we had, modern court documents and newspaper clippings about the cult of Jesus, detailing just how weird and abusive it was. Not to mention just how much Jesus would be castigated by, most modern Christians today for being a pinko, commie, hippie scum, right? I think the existence of Mormonism is a perfect example to say that Christianity definitely would exist today because cults crop up every day, and the leaders who start them are a dime a dozen. And some cults are more successful than others. Some cult leaders never count more than a handful of devoted followers their entire life and ministry. Other cult leaders are elected president. There are nearly infinite variables which contribute to starting, growing, and maintaining a cult. The variables are extensive and often invisible, but the algorithms are largely the same. A smart young boy, and yes, I say boy because that's a core shared trait of this phenomenon. Female and non-binary cult leaders aren't unheard of, but they're so far outshadowed by male cult leaders, right? Like in Joe's time, Ellen G. White, Joanna Southcott, the Universal Friend, they're outliers, which only highlight the trend in this male-dominated phenomenon. So, a smart young boy grows up in a house, usually with lots of his siblings, making the competition for mom's and dad's attention fierce. They never get enough resources to thrive and to flourish from their family, forcing them to seek fulfillment from the outside world. Some combination of their biology and sociology makes these people particularly observant of the world around them, and eventually they learn their most valuable skill set, which serves them for the rest of their lives: manipulation. Now, the lessons are hard but plentiful, and manipulation tactics become a primary tool used by these people. Manipulation is a hammer, and every problem can become a nail. They learn that if they say something one way, it will cause people to hate or fear them. But if they simply say that same thing a different way, then it will cause people to do whatever that person says. Once this tool is utilized and the wielder of said tool becomes a master at using it, the world becomes their sandbox in which these people can build whatever their hearts desire. Manipulation is, at its core, one of the greatest demonstrations of human laziness. Using language, in the case of cult leaders, often language which claims to come from God, to coerce people into doing things they otherwise wouldn't, is inherently lazy. It is mind control. Now, Don't get me wrong. Coercing people to do things that are good for others that's what society, government, that's what the unspoken social contracts in general are all about. Not all coercion or manipulation is bad. What I'm saying is one person manipulating others for their own self-serving interests is absolutely integral to starting a cult, and it is indolence in its most basic form. And a basic motivation of every cult leader is laziness. Populism that brings these people to light and to popularity requires somebody who is an exalted weather vane who moves in turns with the tides and forces of society. But there's a larger point nested in this conversation worth examining here. Society deems knowledge valuable. In today's society, big data drives everything. It's a multi-billion-dollar per year industry. The Mormon Church today is a big data company funding millions of labor hours into collecting genealogy, history, and population data. Knowledge is how society moves, whether progressive or regressive is often a subject of heated debate. We pay people to think, especially when they tell us stuff that we like to hear, or that information and knowledge manifests in some way that is beneficial to everybody. But there's a subtle and important distinction between a principled or ethical philosopher or a scientist and a cult leader. One, we support as a society because their knowledge is valuable and it contributes to the betterment of society, and we like to use technology. The other, we support as a society because we're manipulated into doing so. Those are a vestigial trait of humanity. One of those is a person saying, this is what I think about the world and let's have dialogue. The other is a person saying, this is how the world works because my God told me so. If you dare correct me, then you're my enemy. Do you see the difference here? Philosophy is a noble endeavor and it requires a lifetime of devotion and study. A cult leader is the very antithesis of philosophy. They exist to tell us truth with a capital T. A philosopher exists to ask questions and probe the phenomenon of human consciousness. Philosophy is an inherently tenacious practice and often leads to more questions than answers. On the other hand, cult leaders exist by virtue of shutting down questions with profundities and non-answers, questioning which often leads to adverse consequences for the questioner. A delicate beliefs system balancing on the pillars of manipulation, groupthink, and untestable claims. Cults are inherently lazy. Cult leaders are the pinnacle of human mental lethargy. So what does that say about their followers? Why think about my existence and my ethics when somebody will simply tell me all the answers? It's a lazy existence built on a system of lazy morals. Remarkably, cults can define generations of populations. People can be industrious and hardworking within a system of lazy morals because their work contributes to building this system of lazy morals, this kingdom of lies. Those same people, however, even though they are industrious and hardworking, are lazy. They refuse to let their morals, ethics, or beliefs be questioned because they know for a fact that they already have all the right answers. Probing into their own sense of morals too often conflicts with those answers given to them by their manipulative leaders. So it's far easier to just put those questions on the shelf and ignore them. I'll get the answers to those hard questions after I die. I myself have spent enough time with both cult followers and leaders to know this intellectual indolence firsthand. It is a scourge. It's intellectual cancer, harnessed to shut down human inquisitiveness, ceding ground to that thought-damning phrase, because that's the way it is. These people are as friendly as can be until you introduce a question which shakes their convictions and reveals how inert their beliefs truly are. Then their entire countenance shifts. They become defensive because that question wasn't just targeting what they believe, but a core piece of their identity. And cult leaders thrive on identity. They weaponize identity, regressing their followers into tribalistic behavior and a false victimhood mentality, fabricating a persecution complex out of thin air. They do this because the system of beliefs can't stand up to inquiry or skepticism. Evolving the beliefs would require effort, and harmonizing the cult leaders and followers, and, they've worked tirelessly to secure the belief system as lethargic and monolithic. And this presents a bit of a paradox. Empires built on lies require work to grow and maintain, while simultaneously capturing the worst of human tendencies of torpidity. And I'm so certain I'm right that I will spend every waking moment working to build the kingdom of God. And anyone who questions this is an enemy attacking my identity and deserving of ignoring at best or violence at worst. Right? That example, this is intellectual laziness, and it's unfortunately infectious and hereditary. A person who devotes their life to building up the cult may work 18 hours a day, 365 days of the year. They wouldn't typically be classified as lazy, certainly not by their fellow cult members. But that devotion is deeply rooted in laziness, an unwillingness to confront unknown unknowns and form a personal moral compass. On the other hand, a philosopher may spend weeks at a time in their home reading and writing, never lifting a finger for any manual labor, because their energy is far more valuable when it's expended on thought than physical work. The philosopher may be seen as lazy for spending so little time in work, as we often call physically demanding activities that are not for pleasure, right? But in reality, the scientist or philosopher is expending vast mental resources to attack different angles of what it is to be human or what we observe in our universe. These are not lazy people, and far more often, they leave behind a legacy worth veneration, admiration, and further study, most importantly. The difference is in how these people view the world and what forms the basis of their morality. A philosopher will deal with the trolley problem in complex ways, while the cult leader or follower will simply declare God's will in the matter, an inherently untestable assertion. This paradoxical nature of philosophical versus declaratory morality places the focus of our study at the crux of this paradox. If we view the life and legacy of Joseph Smith, laziness isn't typically an attribute we would use. He built cities, he wrote books, was an editor of multiple newspapers, formed his own armies, ran hundreds of businesses throughout his life, seldom had any time to help raise his children because each day was occupied with building his own empire. These are not activities people would often ascribe to laziness, but I do when I consider the underpinnings of these actions, the root cause, if you will. As much as Joe's legacy is marked by these accomplishments, far more of his day-to-day actions were governed by delegating tasks to people who believed his outlandish and untestable claims. When the impetus behind what he delegated was ever questioned, the answer was always the same: because I said so in the name of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, give me your farm. Thus saith the Lord, build me a city. Thus saith the Lord, kill that person because they're a mobocrat. Thus saith the Lord, and fill in the blank. This is intellectual lethargy. Why is something the way it is? Because God said so. I know because I talk to him all the time. Well, I don't believe that you talk to God. Burn the heretic! And why do we burn the heretic? Because God said so. And self-selection in the body of followers, and of course their violent opposition to anybody who questions, that's, the very threat of intellectual work drags entire populations toward collective stupidity. This laziness is infectious and hereditary. Given long enough to mature and grow, entire populations of people are known by their intellectual laziness. I came from Utah. I grew up a Mormon. That means the work of destroying sacred cows is a long and a labor-intensive process, but more dangerously, it's often seen as attacking entire populations of people when the attacks aren't aimed at the individual so much as the ideology with which they identify. Attacking beliefs versus attacking believers is a subtle but important line that cults thrive on blurring. Identity of members becomes so tightly intertwined with their beliefs that they are unable to see the difference when presented with information that forces them out of their intellectual laziness. It's not anti-Mormons, it's anti-Mormonism. That's an arduous work worthy of investment and determination. Before there was a gold Bible written by Native American Jews in Reformed Egyptian, before angels administered to Joseph Smith in his room late at night, before he had a scribe to write his claimed words of God, Joseph Smith dug for buried treasure. Now, for a young man with a healing leg and an intemperate father as a role model, any way to get money for himself and the Smith family was explored, especially when it didn't involve physical labor. Understandably, when the cake and beer shop and odd jobs for local farmers and other menial hard labor jobs presented too much work, digging for buried treasure provided an easier way to make money. Historian Ronald Walker, who, by the way, was a faithful Mormon, wrote a really good article about Joe's magical treasure hunting, putting it in the context of a larger treasure hunting culture. It's called The Persisting Idea of American Treasure Hunting. Quote, "From colonial times to at least the age of Jackson, Americans dug for magical treasure. There were hundreds and probably thousands of these money diggers, all seeking troves of fabled coins, mines, jewels, and other valued prizes. Yet for all this prodigious toil, their finds were as rare as Merlin's transmuted gold. Relying on an immemorial but now forgotten worldview, the money diggers placed faith in conjuring elemental spirits, thrice-spoken dreams, Syric gifts, and enchanted treasure that could slip and rumble through the earth as easily as a fish moving through the deep. But getting the treasure was always difficult and harrowing. If not recovered quickly, the trove sank into the earth's depths until its next far in the future blooming. Further, the digger might have to outwit the man-like elemental spirit who guarded the treasure. The guardians were often devils who moved treasures about maliciously to prevent their discovery and created distracting specters to impede digging. If such things did not scare the seeker from his booty, they invariably caused him to break the taboo of silence which ended any chance of success. Faced with these odds, the European treasure seeker tried to narrow the odds. To facilitate his search, he listened carefully to the treasure dreams of a pure or innocent youth, who it was believed had special powers to discern and recover the subterranean bounty. Earth mirrors, seer stones, or divining rods, created from hazel or mistletoe, were also thought to be useful searching tools. To prevent the treasure from slipping away through the earth, clever diggers might construct a trench outside and below the chest and approach it from underneath. Such a plan, however, ran the risk of injuring the digger if the peripatetic chest moved downward and fell upon him. Other hunters used magic circles to break the treasure's charm. From antiquity, men had used circles in their devotions, and magicians particularly came to regard the circles as certain fortresses against demons. Money diggers agreed. They encircled their pits to keep the devil out and to protect themselves from the treasure guardian's machination. Swords, sacrifices, and the Bible were also used. The common European pattern placed the adept at the center of the treasure circle, sword or wand in hand, where he observed planetary positions and propitiated the treasure's demons with Old Testament sacrifices, especially of dogs or sheep." End quote. Now, Ronald Walker gives a bunch of examples in this article of just how these old treasure digger stories are. And we find them in ancient Egypt, and in Greek epic poetry, in the Dead Sea Scrolls of ancient Judea. And according to Walker, quote, The ideas of hidden but guarded treasure with their secondary motifs of ancient texts, animals, boses, devils, caves, gold, incantations, mountains, and even the ratifying number of 3 were a part of the central beliefs of the Indo-European folk culture, end quote. They thrived in Europe for millennia. Shakespeare, Alexander Pope, Walter Scott, Edvard Grieg, Heinrich Ibsen, and especially the Germans Goethe and E.T.A. Hoffmann used treasure images in their works. Now, understandably, all of these beliefs crossed the Atlantic to America, where they created the culture in which Joseph Smith grew up. Episodes 1, 152, and 155. Now, these stories may have been old, but they were also always looked down upon by the polite society. Now, there is no evidence that they actually found any treasure. Specifically Joseph Smith's treasure digging troupe ever found any treasure, making it pretty obvious, at least to educated people, that this whole thing was at worst a con and at best a totally unproductive hobby. Notably as well, although there isn't any solid evidence of this occurring with the Smith treasure diggers, buried treasure was a great way to launder counterfeit money. An habitually destitute person walks into the local shop with a bag of gold coins. People are going to be skeptical as to where it came from. I found it while I was digging in the woods. It's a satisfying explanation for a while, and it may even motivate more folks to join the group and to fund treasure digs of their own. Now, when those digs came up dry, of course, the conjuration was performed incorrectly, or somebody spoke out of turn, or the wrong governing planets are overhead, whatever the case was, and then the dupe walks away with their pockets lighter, and the Smiths have a few meals paid for. Now, hardworking people who take the slow, hard way to comfort and wealth, they have always looked at people who chase get-rich-quick schemes as lazy. This is the paradox discussed earlier, right? It can be hard work to be a sucker who believes in ghost stories and magic. I mean, have you ever spent an entire night digging trenches 9 feet deep in order to try to approach a slippery treasure chest from underneath after acquiring the ingredients and chanting the appropriate words for the spell in order to bind the chest in its location? The act of that treasure dig requires a lot of work. The pursuit itself is an effort to get rich quick, and it's regarded as idleness by folks who actually work or study for their paycheck. And it's within this context we should consider what Joe's neighbors said about him, right? And some of it comes from a place of prejudice against treasure diggers and magical pursuits and anybody who uses these get-rich-quick schemes or chases them, right? But there's also another layer here because it's hard to tell whether Joe did much of the actual digging himself, the working part of this lazy endeavor. Lorenzo Saunders, a neighbor, says in a November 1884 affidavit that when the Smiths dug for treasure, Joseph Smith himself didn't actually dig. Joe was the orchestrator. He was the specialist who was performing sacrifices or doing magic to ward away the evil spirits or bind the spirits. And he left the hard work of actually digging in the ground to the grunts of the company. And as the treasure digging company's seer, Joe would have spent more of his time locating the buried treasure with his face buried in a hat that had a rock in it than actually digging for it, often doing so from a remote location. Now, with that said, let's dig into the accounts of this early time. You see what I did there? Dig into the accounts. Yeah, one of these jokes has to land eventually. Anyway, so let's dig into the accounts from some of Joe's neighbors that described him as lazy. Now, in spite of what apologists may claim, the accounts are plentiful and they are far from one-offs of neighbors, just mentioning it in passing. These accounts about the Smith family and Joseph Smith's laziness come from all over the 19th century. Many of them are contemporary. Some of them are later reminiscences, of course, and some are even sworn and notarized affidavits, which historians absolutely love to have. So let's start with a New York neighbor of the Smiths, Parley Chase, who said in a sworn affidavit dated December 13th, 1833, just 3 years after the church started, quote, that not one of the male members of the Smith family were entitled to any credit whatsoever. They were lazy, intemperate, and worthless men, very much addicted to lying. In this, they frequently boasted of their skill. Digging for money was their principal employment." End quote. A March 20th, 1834 affidavit signed by 11 New York neighbors to the Smiths similarly said that the Smiths, quote, "were not only a lazy, indolent set of men, but also intemperate, and their word was not to be depended upon, and that we are truly glad to dispense with their society." End quote. Henry Harris's affidavit, signed December 9th, 1833, said the Smiths, quote, "were regarded by the community in which they lived as a lying and indolent set of men, and no confidence could be placed in them." End quote. Indolent, by the way, hey, it's actually a great indie prog album by the band Slothful. Likewise, William Riley Hine said in an affidavit in the 1880s that he, quote, "heard a man say who was a neighbor to the Mormon Smith family in Palmyra, New York, that they were thieves, indolent, the lowest and meanest family he ever saw or heard of." End quote. A mail carrier who regularly passed through Palmyra on his way back and forth from Canada to Kansas said in an article published in June 7th, 1855, Texas Ranger, that was the name of the publication, quote, "I well remember of hearing frequently of the pranks of Lazy Joe." End quote. Even Lorenzo Saunders, who liked Joe and defended Joseph Smith, repeatedly said that the Smiths were great sugar makers, and also said in a November 12th, 1884 interview that, quote, "Joseph Smith never did work. They claim there in that book that Joe Smith was a great worker. He was a lazy dog, I tell you the truth." End quote. You know, it's not exactly a resounding endorsement for the Smith family's work ethic, but it's also notable that these are the vast majority of statements. Any statements that are contrary to any of these affidavits and quotes we have are few and far between. And most of these statements are, you know, pretty vague and general. They could mean a lot of different forms of laziness and of lying and of intemperance, of course. But there are, however, plenty of statements available which detail this laziness and indolence to a much greater extent. Joshua Stafford was another neighbor of the Smiths in New York, and he said in an affidavit signed November 15th, 1833, once again, just 3 years after the church started, now, when the Smiths first arrived in Palmyra, New York area, they were poor but were laboring people. But then he adds, quote, "A short time after this, they commenced digging for hidden treasures, and soon after they became indolent or lazy, and told marvelous stories about ghosts, hobgoblins, caverns, and various other mysterious matters. Joseph once showed me a piece of wood, which he said he took from a box of money, and the reason he gave for not obtaining the box was that it moved. At another time, he," this is Joseph Jr., "at a husking, called on me to become security for a horse, and said he would reward me handsomely, for he had found a box of watches, and they were as large as his fist, and he put one of them to his ear, and he could hear it tick 40 rods. Since he could not dispose of them profitably at Canandaigua or Palmyra, he wished to go east with them. He said if he did not return with the horse, I might take his life. I replied that he knew I would not do that. Well, said he, I did not suppose you would, yet I would be willing that you should. He was nearly intoxicated at the time of the above conversation." End quote. So, Joshua Stafford's view of Joe as lazy apparently stemmed partly from the fact that, Joe manipulated people into giving him things rather than earning them, right? And partly from the fact that Joe was a drunkard. He liked his whiskey, which, we're actually going to discuss quite a bit in a coming episode of this series here. But that's a pretty good manipulation tactic, right? You sound really sincere if you swear on your life and give someone permission to kill you if you don't come through on your promise. Joe knew that this was an impotent promise with no real consequences because Stafford wasn't a murderer. We can see from these statements that Joe was developing a toolbox of manipulation tactics that he would utilize and expand throughout the remainder of his life, especially when it came to his ministry. Now, his concealment of the claimed gold plates here kind of rings true to this, right? When he claimed to multiple people, including Martin Harris, that if they saw the gold plates uncovered, the penalty would be death on the spot. And let's face it, like, the greatest fear that an imposter carries is being discovered. For that reason, Joe had to invent greater and greater lies, like being killed by God on the spot if you saw his gold plates. And those lies would insulate lower level lies from being discovered. A habitual liar is the laziest person in the room. And these manipulations would manifest by similar tactics when it came to Joe developing higher ranks of church leadership, where participants would gain access to greater mysteries if they would only give their property or give their wife to the prophet, right? If you can't acquire these goods by your own merits or labor, just convince those who already have them to give them up by manipulation and by threats with life and death or even eternal consequences. If the person offering you salvation is also the person threatening you with the punishment, it isn't salvation, it's self-serving extortion. See Council of 50 episodes 168 through 170, Polygamy episodes 116, 148 through 49, and 161, Masonry and Endowment episode 57, 100, 108, 110, and 111, the Mormon Theocracy episodes 66, 72, and 85 and 86, and the Evolving Hierarchy in Mormonism episodes 22, 23, and 25. Another Stafford neighbor of the Smiths, this is David Stafford, expressed similar concerns as his, as I assume his brother Joshua Stafford, and this is an affidavit December 5th, 1833. Quote, I have been acquainted with the family of Joseph Smith Sr., Big Daddy Cheese, for several years, and I know him to be a drunkard and a liar, and to be much in the habit of gambling. He and his boys were truly a lazy set of fellows, and more particularly Joseph, who very aptly followed his father's example, and in some respects was worse. It is well known that the general employment of the Smith family was money digging and fortune telling. They kept around them constantly a gang of worthless fellows who dug for money nights and were idle in the daytime. It was a mystery to their neighbors how they got their living. I will mention some circumstances, and the public may judge for themselves. At different times I have seen them come from the woods early in the morning, bringing meat which looked like mutton. I went into the woods one morning very early shooting partridges, and found Joseph Smith Sr. in a company with two other men with hoes, shovels, and meat that looked like mutton. On seeing me, they run like wild men to get out of sight. Seeing the old man a few days afterwards, I asked him why he runs so the other day in the woods. Ah, said he, you know that circumstances alter cases. It will not do to be seen at all times. End quote. The Smiths were drunkards, they were gamblers, they were secretive with their magical practices, funding their lifestyle by unknown means. Great people to trust starting a religion, right? Gambling and speculation also really fits kind of within the general theme of get-rich-quick schemes, right? And these tendencies would manifest in Joe's ministry through constant land speculation in Kirtland, Missouri, and Nauvoo. The Smiths dug for buried treasure at night, but they were idle during the day. That may help account for why people viewed them as lazy or idle. If you only work while other people are sleeping, they'll never see you work. But once again, that's only if we qualify chasing buried treasure guarded by magical spirits as work. The get-rich-quick idea underpinning the treasure hunts was, at the end of the day, a lazy endeavor. But that's indolence built on indolence, as the very act of, never questioning the mindset which produces the beliefs in magic and the occult that also reveals a level of intellectual laziness discussed at the beginning of the episode. Suffice it to say, the Smiths also didn't seem to have any honest way of making money. And Stafford had reasons to suspect that Joseph Sr., Big Daddy Cheese, might have a bunch of stolen mutton that was stashed in the woods. From where the mutton came, we can only speculate, but the multiple accounts of Smiths sacrificing lambs to the treasure guardian spirits, that kind of that serves to be a pretty good explanation. An anonymous letter was published in the October 26th, 1883 Cincinnati Enquirer by someone who had interviewed some Harmony, Pennsylvania residents. And it says, quote, "From all accounts, he, Joseph Jr., was a lazy, idle, shrewd, plausible schemer and pretender," end quote. And the letter goes on to tell the story of Joe's involvement in a treasure dig for William Hale and Oliver Harper in Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joe met his to-be wife, Emma Hale. And apparently Joe, in his early 20s by now, pointed out a spot where the treasure was buried. Quote, "After digging the depth indicated by Smith, no trace of the treasure was discovered, whereupon Mr. Harper became discouraged. Smith, who was as tricky as a snake, then pretended that there was an enchantment about the place that was removing the treasure further and further away, and said that Harper must get a perfectly white dog and sprinkle its blood over the ground, and that would dispel the obnoxious charm. Work was suspended and a search for a perfectly white dog was begun. None perfectly white could be found in the neighborhood. Smith said perhaps a perfectly white sheep would answer. One was procured, killed, and its blood sprinkled over the ground, and the work of excavation was resumed. No trace of the treasure was found, though 6 holes, one of them 50 feet in diameter and 20 feet deep, were dug. After expending over $2,000 in this fruitless labor, Mr. Harper refused to put in any more money and the digging ceased. Smith said that God Almighty was angry at them for attempting to palm off a white sheep on him for that of a white dog, and so had allowed the enchantment to remove the treasure which was there when they began operations." End quote. The content of this letter, although late and anonymous, reveals many aspects of how treasure digging was developed and conducted as a con from the very beginning. Now, if this were the only account that historians have, it would be anti-Mormon and rightfully regarded as ridiculous. But given the plethora of similar accounts ranging from contemporary sources, and from contemporary as well as many decades later, along with the remarkable consistency in the methods and practices used in the treasure digs, the accusations that these are anti-Mormon lies falls under the crushing weight of all of these statements taken together. It also reveals the pattern of a habitual liar, right? When they are faced with no resolution other than admitting that it was all made up, you just turn to deflection and finally say that, well, Daddy was too mad at us, so he didn't allow us to be successful, right? There was no bottom to these lies. There was no bedrock to them. There was always somewhere else to dig. Now, there was always a place to retreat when the treasure digs were unsuccessful. That's a pattern revealed in Joe's ministry as well. If something went wrong or somebody called Joe out on a lie, an excuse or some form of retreat always existed for the prophet of God. Any master manipulator always knows the locations of all the exits in the room. This treasure dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania is really important because while Joe was working for William Hale and Oliver Harper, he stayed at the home of Isaac Hale and got to know Isaac's daughter, Emma Hale. Emma and Joe eventually eloped against her parents' wishes. And in August 1827, Joe's Palmyra neighbor, Peter Ingersoll, a friend of the Smiths, accompanied Joe to the Hale home in Harmony to pick up Emma's belongings and furniture to transport them back to Palmyra. When they arrived at Isaac Hale's home, according to Peter Ingersoll, quote, his father-in-law, Mr. Isaac Hale, addressed Joseph in a flood of tears. "You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to her grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people." Joseph wept and acknowledged he could not see in a stone now nor never could, and that his former pretensions in that respect were all false. He then promised to give up his old habits of digging for money and looking into stones. Mr. Hale told Joseph if he would move to Pennsylvania and work for a living, he would assist Joseph in getting into business. Joseph acceded to this proposition. End quote. Isaac Hale and Emma's brother Alva also independently reported this incident. And according to Isaac's affidavit that's dated March 20th, 1834, quote, Smith stated to me that he had given up what he called glass looking and that he expected to work hard for a living and was willing to do so, end quote. And according to Alva, Joe admitted that, quote, peeping in seer stones for treasure was all damned nonsense. He, Smith, was deceived himself but did not intend to deceive others, that he intended to quit the business of peeping and labor for his livelihood, end quote. When he was pushed too far, he came clean with all of it. For a brief time, right? Because when Joe and Emma were first married, this was his chance. Joe had a chance to alter his ways. He could have abandoned his lazy past. He could have reformed and made the right decision and gotten into the farming business with the assistance of his father-in-law. He could have done that. Instead, however, laziness transcends the wishes of a disapproving father-in-law and of public condemnation. If only Joe had kept this promise, right? American history would look very different. Now, I also want to tease apart what Alva claimed that Joe said, right? That he was deceived, but that he didn't intend to deceive others. For a brief moment, the curtain is torn from the charlatan, and the wizard pulling the levers is revealed. Evidence like this leads Dan Vogel, among other historians, to stick with the pious fraud theory of Joseph Smith, that he was a fraud to begin with, and he used piety and religion as his cover to sell the fraud. And I tend to agree, right? Being cognizant of one's own deception rules out many cognitive functions, which would tend to posit that Joe was, personally deceived, or that he sincerely believed in what he said throughout his life. Joe absolutely knew it was all a fraud all along, and preserving that fraud found Joe in more intense and dire situations as his ministry evolved, and his ministry grew, and more people and more controversial things happened in the church, and all of his ministry was predicated on his inherent dishonesty and his laziness to deal with his affinity for dishonesty. And Joe's involvement in magical money digging, that got him into trouble with the law in 1826, the same year that the American Temperance Society was formed in Boston. When Joe was working as a treasure seer for Josiah Stowell in South Bainbridge, New York. Now, Josiah Stowell, as we call him, Bossman Joe, to separate him from Big Daddy Cheese and Joe, right? Bossman Josiah Stowell was a full believer in Joe's magical powers, right? But Josiah Stowell's nephew, Peter Bridgman, could see Joseph Smith for the listless and lazy liar he was at heart. So Peter Bridgman brought charges against Joseph Smith under a New York statute from 1811. Now, this is the relevant portion of the statute under which Joe was charged. Quote, all persons who not having wherewith to maintain themselves live idle without employment, and also all persons who go about from door to door or place themselves in the streets, highways, or passages to beg in the cities or towns where they respectively dwell, and all jugglers, and all persons pretending to have skill in physiognomy, palmistry, or like crafty science, or pretending to tell fortunes, or to discover where lost goods may be found, shall be deemed and adjudged disorderly persons, end quote. So by virtue of this 1811 law existing, people like Joseph Smith were common, and they were seen as a blight on enlightened society. And at its core, this is basically a vagrancy law that was loaded with other definitions to kind of dragnet a lot of really unpleasant people together under the same criminal statute of disorderly person. The term crafty science here refers explicitly to the practices of magic and occultism employed by the Smiths and many other, people who were steeped in these traditions for locating and extracting the non-existent treasure that Joe would supposedly see underground with his peeping stone. It was an art practiced by the lowest in society, aimed at the credulous middle class to extract those people's money through minimal effort. It's no different from fortune tellers and astrologers in LA making celebrities their chief clientele today, right? But at the same time, there were laws back then against it, which were obviously enforced. But if we just let the market regulate itself with all of this this pseudoscience, it'll all just die off, right? Just let the market regulate itself. Unfortunately, people are just too stupid to self-regulate without draining their pockets with buffalo excrement at best or killing themselves at worst. And Joe was charged with a misdemeanor as a disorderly person because he lived idle with no employment except for the crafty science, right? Pretending to discover where lost goods were found and then taking money for his services, which were clearly a con, right? This was crafty science. And I can't, for the life of me, figure out why the phrase crafty science is no longer in our modern lexicon or in our stare decisis, right? Crafty science is such a useful phrase. So bossman Josiah Stowell actually testified at this 1826 trial in Joe's defense, even though Stowell was the guy who Joe was, he was Joe's mark, right? He was the guy that Joe was extracting the money on. He was putting the con on Stowell, but Stowell testified on Joe's defense, on Joseph Smith's behalf. Stowell confirmed that he hired Joe to search for several treasures, but he denied that Joe was only pretending. Josiah Stowell said, quote, that he positively knew that the prisoner could tell and did possess the art of seeing those valuable treasures through the medium of said stone, end quote. And then Stowell went on to give a couple examples of how he knew that Joe really had these magical powers, this crafty science. And on one occasion, quote, the prisoner had looked through said stone for Deacon Addleton for a mine, did not exactly find it, but got a piece of ore which resembles gold, he thinks, end quote. So Joe helped Deacon Addleton, find this mine. They didn't find the mine, but Joe promised him this gold mine. And although they didn't find any gold, they found like iron pyrite or something, right? It's known as fool's gold for a good reason. It's an easy mistake to make, but it proved that it proved to Josiah Stowell anyway, that Joe could actually see things in his stone because Josiah Stowell was credulous enough to believe it, to believe in this crafty science, right? On another occasion, the, quote, prisoner had told by means of this stone where a Mr. Bacon had buried money, that he and prisoner had been in search of it. That prisoner had said it was in a certain root of a stump 5 feet from the surface of the earth, and with it would be found a tail feather. That said Stowell and prisoner thereupon commenced digging, found a tail feather, but money was gone, that he supposed the money moved down, end quote. So Joe planted a feather, and that was enough to prove to bossman Josiah Stowell beyond a shadow of a doubt that Joe had magic powers, the crafty science of using his seer stone to locate buried treasure, right? These schemes were clearly premeditated to acquire money through the smallest amount of work possible. And that kind of leaves a question standing as the elephant in the room, right? These treasure digging practices, these all occurred during the period that Joe claimed that he was like communing with angels after his great, theophany, right? Of seeing God and Jesus, at least as the story goes, the latest version of the story goes, right? And soon before he would actually author the Book of Mormon, right? So when exactly during the 1820s that Joe was doing all this stuff, did he change his ways? When did this treasure digging con change from a way to make an easy dollar to being divinely sanctioned scripture writing and religion building? When did Joe stop being a loafing deceiver and become a prophet of God, right? That's the central question here. Maybe, and I know this is going to be pretty far out there, but maybe the con never stopped. Now, in this case, this 1826 case, the witnesses for the prosecution, Arad Stowell, a Mr. McMaster, and Jonathan Thompson gave a few more examples. Now, Arad Stowell and Mr. McMaster testified that to try to prove Joe's abilities to them, Joe, quote, laid a book upon a white cloth, and proposed looking through another stone which was white and transparent, hold the stone to the candle, turn his head to book, and read. The deception appeared so palpable that witness went off disgusted." End quote. So what is that? It's really unclear what happened here, but maybe Joseph Smith had memorized passages from the book in advance and told him to lay it on the table and he would read it through a seer stone. Or maybe Joe was kind of tilting his head out of his hat and, to kind of peek at the pages as he was reading. But, the result of it was the same. Whatever Joe did, these two guys weren't fooled. They saw what was going on and they went off disgusted because it was so clearly a con, right? These are all manipulation tools. They're all tactics that Joe was learning. And Joe's ability to locate and read a mark, a prospective person to be conned, that became one of his greatest skills, which would serve him the rest of his life. And now it's likely his deceptions that were aimed at Josiah Stowell were no more believable than that little book reading example, but Bossman Joe's credulity made him an easy mark for Joseph Smith. And that's one of the first skills that a successful con person learns is identifying easy marks. How far that con person goes with that mark, or how much they take that mark for a ride, that's far more up to the mark than it is to the con person themselves. Now, Jonathan Thompson in this 1826 trial tells about a different incident. Quote, "Prisoner was requested to look for a chest of money, did look, and pretended to know there it was, and that prisoner, Thompson, and yeomans went in search of it. That Smith arrived at spot first, was at night, that Smith looked in a hat while there, and when very dark, told how the chest was situated. After digging several feet, struck upon something sounding like a board or plank. Prisoner would not look again, pretending that he was alarmed on account of the circumstances relating to the trunk being buried, which came all fresh to his mind. That the last time he looked, he discovered distinctly the two Indians who buried the trunk, that a quarrel ensued between them, and that one of said Indians was killed by the other and thrown into the hole beside the trunk to guard it, as he supposed." End quote. So when it comes to these magic practices used as cons, right, there always needs to be an out. Joe always knew where the exit was. And something in the spell was said wrong, or the participants were in the wrong mindset. The wrong planets are governing the season. The dog was spotted instead of pure white. One of the diggers has indigestion. Whatever the excuse, the person orchestrating the con has to be able to blame something when it doesn't work as they propose. For Joe and the treasure diggers, the chest just kept sinking. Thompson continues, quote, "Thompson says that he believes in the prisoner's professed skill. He believes in it. He believes in the prisoner's professed skill." Continues, "that the board which he struck his spade upon was probably the chest, but on account of an enchantment, the trunk kept settling away from under them when digging. That notwithstanding they continued constantly removing the dirt, yet the trunk kept about same distance from them." End quote. It's amazing. The pursuit of worldly treasures by utilizing the power of magic like this never pans out. The pursuit of worldly treasures by utilizing the power of God is obviously the next logical step because it rarely fails. Now, oddly enough, in that previous quote, Thompson was called as a witness for the prosecution, but he actually ended up saying that he believed that Joe could see things in the seer stone. So I guess his testimony also sort of supported the defense. I'm not sure. There is some consistency to these various witness statements that they believed that Joe could actually see what he claimed that he could see, but that they were merely unsuccessful in finding the treasure when they would dig for it. Now, these testimonies foreshadowed what would be a common theme in Joe's ministry. People believed what he said even when evidence was right in front of their faces that would indicate the contrary. Joe refused to make his money from honest hard work, so his charisma was his tool of choice to get people to give him their money. Now, this infamous 1826 trial record ends by saying, quote, "And therefore the court find the defendant guilty," end quote. Now, in some ways, this looks like legal proof that Joe was a disorderly, idle person with no employment except for pretending to look for lost objects and buried treasure. And the truth is actually a little more complicated, and it allows apologists to kind of carve out interpretations of the evidence which don't cast Joe into such a negative light, right? This was just a pre-trial hearing. So the guilty verdict here was only an indictment. It wasn't actually a conviction. William D. Purple and Abraham W. Benton and Joel K. Noble all said that Joseph was either released or he was allowed to escape on leg bail. That's a quote, leg bail, without a trial, either because he was a minor at the time or because the court didn't want to impugn Josiah Stowell's reputation with this embarrassing trial. Now, people will say that Joe was never convicted in that trial as exonerating evidence that Joe was actually an honest young man, but the summary of the evidence is easily belied by reading the statements themselves, which described Joe's conduct as just run-of-the-mill con artistry and quote-unquote crafty sciences, right? 4 years later, in 1830, Joe was rearrested to finally be put on trial on the charge of disorderly person. But this time, he was acquitted because of the statute of limitations. Too long a time had passed since the crime. So the 1830 trial, however, produced some very amusing testimony. At this trial, Josiah Stowell testified about a horse that Joe had borrowed and never returned. Now, it's amazing here because bossman Josiah Stowell remained certain that Joe would eventually pay this debt. Quote, "I hold his note for the price of the horse, which I consider as good as the pay, for I am well acquainted with Joseph Smith Jr. and know him to be an honest man, and if he wishes, I am ready to let him have another horse on the same terms," end quote. It's amazing. Like, Joe combined tactics of mind control. He had a complete hold on bossman Josiah Stowell, right? Like, Joe was clearly working on honing his skills of cult mind control before the whole Gold Bible story was widely circulated, as evidenced by the 1826 trial. Now, the development of his skills is revealed in the differences between what Stowell said in the 1826 trial versus the 1830 trials. Stowell and other wealthy men became the marks of Joseph Smith, and Joe bled them dry while utilizing cult mind control tactics to the point they implicitly trusted him with anything and everything that Joe needed, all while the majority of other people connected with the Smith family regarded them as lazy and intemperate hucksters. Now, whether Josiah Stowell or Not So Smarty Martin Harris, or Newell K. Whitney, or John Johnson, or any other well-off mark that was targeted by Joe, the sunk cost fallacy will cause otherwise reasonable people to do the dumbest things and sacrifice their livelihood. Now, Abram W. Benton also recorded this fantastic exchange between Josiah Stowell and the prosecution's lawyer in the 1830 trial. It's question and answer. Quote, "Did Smith ever tell you there was money hid in a certain place which he mentioned?" "Yes." "Did you dig?" "Yes." "Did you find any money?" "No." "Did he not lie to you then and deceive you?" "No. The money was there, but we did not get quite to it." "How do you know it was there?" "Smith said it was." End quote. What could I possibly say about this interaction that it doesn't say for itself, right? That exchange needs no commentary. Joseph Smith was many things, but a master manipulator of credulous minds may truly be his crowning character trait. But for our purposes, the money quote from the 1830 trial comes from the testimony of Addison Austin. According to Austin, during the time period when Joe was leading treasure hunts for Josiah Stowell, Austin got Joe alone, quote, and asked him to tell honestly whether he could see this money or not. And Austin said that, quote, Smith hesitated for some time, but finally replied, "To be candid between you and me, I cannot, any more than you or anybody else, but any way to get a living, end quote. Any way to get a living, which doesn't involve swinging an axe or tilling a field, keeping a ledger book, hammering metal, milking a cow, studying books, or building a cabinet anyway, right? Joe's lethargy for work is a notable pattern emerging from the earliest accounts about his life, including these court records from 1826 and 1830. Now, one other detail worth noting in this hearing alone in 1830, Bossman Josiah Stowell's daughters were called to testify against Joseph Smith about him being, let's just say, improper towards them. But that's a story for a different time in our series, episodes 11, 12, and 21. Now, all of this was happening during the gestation period of the Book of Mormon, right? Joe's greatest undertaking ruled by laziness. After Joe claimed that he had gotten the gold plates from Moroni in 1827, or maybe it was Nephi, maybe Moroni, we don't, nobody really knows. He started writing the Book of Mormon with Martin Harris, not so smarty Marty, in the spring of that year. By the way, Marty, he was a farmer, and spring is a super important time for farmers. If you don't get your crops in the ground in the spring, the entire season is lost. Marty, instead, spent all spring as a scribe for Joe because, let's face it, writing words on paper is really hard work. And why write them when you can just speak them to somebody else who will write them for you? Apropos of nothing, thank you again, Chris Smith, for helping me write the episodes that are going into this series. Now, the consequences of this are borne out in Lucy Mack Smith's personal memoir on page 132, where she claimed that 2/3 of Marty's crop that year were lost because Marty was acting as a scribe for Joseph Smith. Plus, Joe and Emma were living off of Marty's dime during that entire time that Marty worked as Joe's scribe, which that adds up after a long time, right? Especially after just losing an entire season of crops. This began the long and painful process of Joe bleeding Marty completely dry over many years. Now, tradition says that they translated about 116 pages, although it may actually have been much more than that. And then Martin Harris asked to borrow the manuscript to take it home to show his skeptical wife, Lucy Harris. Smart, right? Somehow the manuscript disappeared from Martin's desk drawer, and the most popular theory is that his wife, Lucy, burned it, although that's a hotly disputed story among historians even today, and that story only emerges as, kind of the go-to story much later than the actual event. It may also have been a test by Marty, as he had tested Joe's abilities multiple times, episodes 3 and 4. The result is the same, though. Joe was devastated, and he took a long break from the quote-unquote translation process, from writing the book. When he started writing again, he picked up from where he left off rather than starting over from the beginning. Only when he got to the end of the book did he go back and replace the lost pages, mostly as an autobiography. Now, the lost manuscript pages, they posed a huge problem because Joe couldn't perfectly reproduce what he had originally written. And for all that he knew, the manuscript of the 116 pages was still out there somewhere. So if he tried to rewrite the same thing, then somebody could produce the original manuscript and point out discrepancies between the replacement pages and the original, right? At least that was his way of dealing with the trouble, right? Fortunately for Joe, God had a plan. God built a back door into this problem. According to Joe, he had previously translated from the large plates of Lehi, but there was another set of plates called the small plates of Nephi, which told the same story in abbreviated form from the perspective of Nephi instead of his dad, Lehi. How convenient is that? It's like God planned it all along or something. Or that he's a con man and the whole thing's a lie. As a con man, he always knew where an exit was. He always knew how to deflect. He always knew how to get out of a lie, right? So he could just translate that smaller portion, right? Now, this is the part in the South Park episode about Joseph Smith where Stan bursts out, wait, Mormons actually know this story and they still believe Joseph Smith was a prophet, right? And, on a personal note, That South Park episode was like my first shelf item at the impressionable age of 14 years old. Historians Chris Smith and Dan Vogel did a 2-part deconstruction of everything that South Park got right and wrong that you can find on YouTube. It really is a spectacular couple of hours of watching. Now, back to it. I digress, right? Sorry. The replacement pages for the lost 116 pages serve as an interesting case study for Joe's authorship methodology. The replacement was like an abridged, a shorter version of the events that were already described in the pages that were lost, but he uses a ton of filler material, and a considerable amount is autobiographical with names of characters only slightly changed. Isaac Hale becomes Ishmael, and Nephi sounds like his father's name, Lehi, like Joe Sr. and Joe Jr., right? Nephi has 2 older brothers with a younger brother named Samuel, just like Joseph Smith. It's remarkable. But it isn't just the autobiographical tendencies. In the replacement pages, he copies chapter after chapter of Isaiah verbatim from the King James Version of the Bible. And then, at some point, Joe just runs out of steam and he breezes over hundreds of years of Nephite history in the short books of Enos, Jerem, Omni, and Words of Mormon, each of which is only a single chapter long. Now, these are basically the minor prophets of the Book of Mormon, and each chapter essentially describes the plates being transferred from one prophet historian to the next with very little other material. Gerald and Sandra Tanner, 2, prominent critics of the LDS Church, call this the black hole in the Book of Mormon. And basically this black hole exists because Martin Harris lost the original manuscript and Joe's replacement was under a time crunch and also simplistic and lazy. Episode 17. After the publication of the Book of Mormon in April 1830, Joe started a religion, the Church of Christ. That's the same year that the fountain pen was actually patented. Fun fact. Throughout this whole period, Joe was dictating, not writing for himself, revelations from God that eventually were compiled to be the Book of Commandments, later republished as the Doctrine and Covenants, with some extra theological material known as the Lectures on Faith. Each of these revelations are self-serving, some of them more than others. As David Michael and I went through the revelations on the My Book of Mormon podcast before Marie took over for David, we figured out pretty quickly that Joe essentially created a currency of revelations. When he wanted somebody to do something for him in the church, they'd get a revelation, some of which were identical copy-paste revelations that were just given to different people. One of these revelations that I find extremely revealing of Joe's mentality while he was establishing his new religion is Doctrine and Covenants section 24, dated July 1830. So like 3 to 4 months after Joe, started the religion. This revelation is addressed directly to Joe, and it says, quote, "For thou shalt devote all thy service in Zion, but in temporal labors thou shalt not have strength, for this is not thy calling. Attend to thy calling in Zion, and thou shalt have wherewith to magnify thine office and to expound all scriptures." End quote. In this revelation, God, the omnipotent creator of the universe, told Joe, hey, you know what, buddy? Temporal work, sweep floors, batting rugs, laundry, that's not your strong suit. So instead, you should devote yourself entirely to the hard spiritual work of explaining Scripture. From watching circuit rider preachers collecting money during revivals to authoring his own revelation that, his time should be devoted to the church and only to the church, right? The cycle continues through another con man. It's not hard to see what Joe's doing here. When you take on a project like starting a church, or for example, creating, editing, and producing a podcast on the history of said church, it's a lot easier to focus on that one thing when you don't have a day job. Joe was able to swear off all physical labor for money and tell everybody that his church was to be his one and only focus. He, however, did so by claimed divine command instead of starting a GoFundMe for a history book he has yet to deliver on. That was a little too real. Chris, did you write that in the script? Moving on. Another passage within that same section, Doctrine and Covenants, section 24, harkens to Joe's previous troubles with the law, while simultaneously reinforcing his reliance on the tithes of the church for support. Quote, "And whosoever shall go to law with thee shall be cursed by the law." I love that. It's like Joe had been burned by the system, by the legal system a couple of times now, and anyone who takes him to law shall be cursed by the law. I love that. It wasn't until Nauvoo that was actually, that revelation came true, but it eventually did because he controlled the legal system in Nauvoo. It just took him building his own Mormon theocracy and his own empire to make that revelation come true. Anyway, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It continues, D&C 24, quote, "And thou shalt take no purse nor scrip, neither staves, neither two coats, for the church shall give unto thee in the very hour what thou needest for food and for raiment, and for shoes and for money, and for scrip." End quote. Basically, hey, Joe, can you come help me lift this thing? Come on, Ollie. You know what the big man upstairs thinks about me lifting a thing? And well, by the way, we need more tithing because Joey needs a new wardrobe, right? It's amazing. Like, Mormons consider the phrase "oh my God" is taking the Lord's name in vain. But when a guy tells his hundreds of followers that God said he doesn't have to ever work again for money, like, I can't think of a greater example of taking the Lord's name in vain. It's a stark contrast from like the claims that church leaders make today that the church is run by lay clergy, while, the highest leadership takes living stipends that Joe would have salivated over. And they also are sitting on a veritable dragon's hoard of wealth of over $100 billion, right? It's vanity, it's hypocrisy, and it's all rooted in an indescribable loathing of manual labor and honest work. So once Joe arrived in Kirtland after commanding his church to relocate to Ohio and Missouri from New York, this trend of God giving Joe the cakewalk through life accelerated. In June of 1831, and 1831, that's the same year that Clement Studebaker of Studebaker Cars was born. I want an Avanti so bad. I want one. The 63 R3 model, there's only like 1,200 of them made with the supercharged 304 or the 4-speed. It could do freaking 180 miles per hour in the early 1960s. Are you freaking kidding me? If you have one, call me. Anyway, I digress. In June of 1831, when Clement Studebaker was born, Joseph Smith was in Kirtland, but he had been prophesying that the quote-unquote New Jerusalem, or Zion, would be located in Missouri. This was the Mormon promised land, but Joe hadn't actually been to Missouri yet. He'd only read from it being described in letters to him from the original missionaries that went out there, including Oliver Cowdery, right? Unfortunately, his powers of remote viewing with the seer stone didn't cut it, as it had so many times in the past. So in June of 1831, Joe decided that it was time that he went and saw Missouri for himself to properly declare a specific place, Zion. Now, he received a revelation that commanded 28 elders to travel from Ohio to Missouri. One of those elders was Ezra Booth. Now, this experience ended up being so disillusioning for Ezra Booth that he left the church and wrote the first insider's expose of the church. And of course, you can see the exclusive feed on patreon.com/nakedmormonism, where we read through the entire Ezra Booth letters in Mormonism Unveiled for our NAMO book club, patreon.com/nakedmormonism. But according to Ezra Booth, Joe's revelation told the elders to go to Missouri on foot. Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Martin Harris, and Edward Partridge, however, were told to go by carriage and steamboat, funded largely by Not So Smarty Marty. The leaders traveled in comfort, while the laymen begged their way to Missouri like hobos. At least some things from Joe's church survived into the modern church. But when Joe got to this soon-to-be-declared Holy Land, he was extremely disappointed. He found 20 log cabins that were mostly occupied by drunks, and only a handful of people there had actually converted to Mormonism. According to Ezra Booth, quote, "We expected to find a large church which Smith said was revealed to him in a vision Oliver had raised up there. This large church was found to consist of 3 or 4 females," end quote. Priorities, right, Ezra? So, to Ezra Booth's great disappointment, the whole trip ended up being pointless. Joe laid the foundation of the temple, which was fine, and that's cool and all, but it wasn't worth walking all the way to Missouri to go see. That was like 1,000 miles. And then Joe was done with this backwater country, and he returned to Kirtland, Ohio. And according to Ezra Booth, quote, "Before they went to Missouri, Joseph Smith's language was, 'We shall winter in Ohio, but one more winter,' end quote. But once they got to Missouri, Joseph changed his tune and declared, quote, 'It will be many years before we come here, for there is a great work to be done first,' end quote." Episodes 25 and 26. Now, Ezra Booth's explanation of why Joe returned to Kirtland and left building up Zion to other people was that, quote, "It is much easier and better suited to their dispositions to write commandments in Kirtland than to gain a livelihood by the sweat of their brow in Missouri. And indeed, Smith has commanded himself not to labor, and by his mandate, by the word of God, right? Thus saith the Lord, and by his mandate has enjoined it upon the church to support him. Bishop Edward Partridge, when we were in Missouri, intimated that Smith and others were too much inclined to laziness. Smith replied, 'I am commanded not to labor,' end quote." Like, God told me my job isn't to work. Like, a few quotes from Joseph Smith throughout this series really encapsulate his entire life in so few words like this one. Like last week, it was the quote about, building the Nauvoo House Hotel so that the rich people will pour their gold and silver into Nauvoo until the Mormons are sick of receiving them. This quote, however, summarizes his work ethic, his manipulation tactics, his general lethargy towards honest labor, and his taking God's name in vain for little crap like this throughout his entire ministry. It's a remarkable quote. And it's amazing to make like tongue-in-cheek examples about God commanding Joe not to do a thing, and then to have a contemporary who left the church, the first insider's expose of the church, say that exact thing happened. It shows us today that Joe not only used God's name to tell him not to work, but would also quote that revelation to people when he was in a situation that required him to actually work. Somebody would say, "Hey, Joe, can you come help me lift this thing?" And he would actually say, "You know that God told me that I'm commanded not to labor. Sorry, you got to lift that thing for yourself. Or, get one of the other elders. I've made Ollie my lackey this whole time. I mean, he's really good to help lift stuff." It's so amazing to me. His job was talking to God, and anybody who didn't like it wasn't faithful to the work and therefore didn't believe Joe actually spoke for God. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because anybody regarding these statements with skepticism, like Ezra Booth, simply leave. And the only people left are the sycophants who never question the prophet of God or anything the prophet claimed God said. While Joe lived at Kirtland, the church in Missouri had a series of troubles with their non-Mormon Missourian neighbors. We're going to discuss that in coming episodes at length, but for now we need to understand that one of the major sources of tension between these two folks was the fact that the Missourians were mostly from the South. They were slaveholding Democrats in the northernmost slave state in America that was north of the Mason-Dixon line, whereas the Mormons were mostly from the North. So they just had different cultural attitudes towards the enslavement of black people. The Book of Mormon is anti-slavery. The Nephites outlawed slavery, whereas the ferocious and wicked, in quotes, ferocious and wicked Lamanites practiced slavery. In 1832, Joe received his famous Civil War revelation, which predicted that a civil war would begin in South Carolina and that slaves would rise against their masters. This revelation was not disclosed to the public because it was too explosive, and the reaction from the non-Mormons in Missouri would not have been good. It does, however, illustrate to us that Joe kept his eye on current events for anything that he could wrap into his theology or could demonstrate his feigned powers of prophecy. In 1833, Double Dub Phelps, William Wines Phelps, published a newspaper article in which he advised against free people of color immigrating to Missouri as members of the church because they'd be considered property once they got there. Unfortunately, the Missourians interpreted the article as an invitation to free people of color to immigrate, and the reaction was violent. The racist citizens of Jackson County, Missouri, expelled the Mormons from the county in 1833. Unfortunately, this bad reaction from the Missourians sent Joe into PR damage control mode, and he showed zero moral backbone by changing his stance on slavery from his northern culture. The church issued an official declaration in August 1835 that said the North had, quote, no right to interfere with bond servants nor baptize them contrary to the will and wish of their masters, nor cause them to be dissatisfied with their situations in this life, end quote. And in April 1836, just a year later, coincidentally, the same year that Samuel Colt patented the revolving cylinder pistol, Joe published an anti-abolitionist sermon that warned that abolitionism might lead to racial miscegenation and possible race war. He also said it was the decree of Jehovah that blacks be slaves. Check out Glassbox Podcast, episodes 48 and 49. Now, put a pin in Joe's stance on slavery because we're going to discuss that April 1836 pamphlet in a minute here. Richard Bushman summarized Joe's general work ethic quite well in his biography, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. Now, Bushman is a believing Mormon, but to his credit, he actually admits to Joseph Smith's flaws and he remains in good standing with the church after publishing about many controversial aspects of Joe's life in this book. Speaking about the Kirtland years, Bushman says, quote, how the Smiths paid the bills in these years is a mystery. Joseph's journal shows no evidence of working for money. In 1834, he had been granted the stewardship of a farm near the temple site, but he recorded no income or benefit. That was the farm of Freddie G. Willie. He never mentioned doing farm work or supervising anyone's labors. Later, he opened a store in Kirtland, but the store was not profitable. Joseph's followers helped by bringing food, half a fattened hog from John Tanner, a quarter beef from Shadrach Roundy. Others gave Joseph money or forgave borrowed sums, end quote. So Joe's financial profile in Kirtland is, let's just say it was troubled at best. Now, I know we talk about his finances a lot on the show, but it's kind of a recurring theme when so many of his actions were obviously motivated by the quickest way to get the most money with the least amount of effort possible. It was all money. Chase it back to the money, right? He ran his church on credit, and he did so while constructing the largest building in the city, the Kirtland Temple. By the time the temple completed construction, Joe had no way to pay off the $40 to $60K in debt that he had incurred. He'd absorbed by divine fiat all of the businesses of wealthy members by declaring the church a socialist system run through bishops' storehouses, and land speculation was obviously a common pastime, especially land in Missouri that was super cheap. Joe could issue a revelation commanding the Mormons to forgive him of all of his debts, but that solution didn't exactly hold water like, a tight dish for people who didn't believe that he was a prophet, which were the majority of people to which the dude owed money. So when you run out of money and creditors are beating down your door, what do? Well, you start your own bank and you print your own money. Who needs to labor extensively and pay down debts through hard labor and ethical business practices when you can simply make money and sell stocks in the Kirtland Safety Society anti-banking company? And this worked for a while, but the inert banknotes eventually caught up and lawsuits were filed and judgments declared church property into the hands of creditors. And then Joe and the leadership fled to the Missouri church under the cover of night. Joe running from his problems, that was a pretty common tactic when life became a little too hard to work through those problems. Now, when Joe got to Missouri, he wasn't there for very long, and things were pretty intense for most of the time. So here is a good time to talk about one of those primary tensions between the Mormons and the Missourians, which had been brewing for over half a decade by the time that Joe got there. So let's pull that pin back out of Joe's stance on slavery now in that April 1836 pamphlet. The Mormons came largely from northern states, which meant that most of them were either abolitionists or generally not pro-slavery. Missouri has always been a controversial state when it comes to race relations, right? And it's the northernmost slave state in America at the time, north of the Mason-Dixon line. And to this day, Missouri is one of the most racially charged states in America, owing to it being that northernmost slave state above the Mason-Dixon line. And that, the Mason-Dixon line, of course, delineated between the South slave states and the northern non-slave states, right? The most infamous Supreme Court ruling in American history, the Dred Scott decision, centered around whether or not the Scots were considered citizens, having lived in northern states where slavery was illegal, and then moved to Missouri. This 1857 case is a blight on American jurisprudence, and in many ways it served as one of the primary catalysts that resulted in the Civil War just half a decade after it was decided. This all occurred while Mormon Utah was a slave-holding theocracy, but I digress. So needless to say, tensions about the slave issue plagued Mormon and Missourian relationships when the Mormons published from their Jackson County base the Evening and the Morning Star, and they would teach freed slaves how to read by offering them fellowship and Book of Mormon study classes. And of course, the slaveholders in Missouri lost their damn minds. And this was in addition to a number of controversial revelations given by Joe, which caused these tensions to increase. And these revelations, some of them claimed the Gentiles' property, meaning that the non-Mormons in Missouri, they were to consecrate the property of the Gentiles to the bishop's storehouse, which is just a nice way to package the concept of theft. Also, Jackson County was to be the central location of the Mormon millennium, meaning that a number of Mormons living there, that was only going to increase. More Mormons resulted in the Mormons having greater political power, which, once again, could threaten the way of life of the Southern Democrat slaveholders that ran the state of Missouri. Missourians didn't want their government filled with a bunch of abolitionist Yankees who were trying to teach freed slaves how to read from the Book of Mormon, possibly leading to an uprising. So, all of that is to say that slavery was an issue that Joe repeatedly changed his stance on throughout his ministry. It can be easily demonstrated that his statements about states' rights versus slavery, abolitionism, were influenced by current events and what happened to the Mormons in Missouri. The first of these stances was basically indifference, although the Book of Mormon is sort of anti-slavery. Passages from Alma 27 and Mosiah 2 are inherently anti-slavery. However, as the Mormons settled in greater numbers in Missouri, Joe remained silent on these passages and really on the entire subject of slavery, not publishing anything official about it. It wasn't until Dub Phelps published that little pamphlet titled Free People of Color in Missouri that the leadership made a statement about slavery. And that statement quoted extensively Missouri law in stating that, quote, "No free Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in this state under any pretext whatever," end quote. And further made the official stance of the church that, quote, "slaves are real estate in this and other states, and wisdom would dictate great care among the branches of the Church of Christ on this subject. So long as we have no special rule in the church as to people of color, let prudence guide, shun every appearance of evil," end quote. So Phelps basically just said we're pro-states' rights until we have a special rule in the church. That left the door wide open for Joe to issue a revelation claiming that slavery is evil and against the will of God. But Joe didn't. Joe never claimed God said anything negative about slavery during his actual ministry. In the 1830s and 40s in America, just a couple of decades before the Civil War, importing of new slaves from Africa was already illegal by the time he started his church. And still, his God said nothing bad about slavery. It is mind-blowing. Like, he not only never said, that thus saith the Lord, slavery is wrong, you shouldn't hold people as property. He took the opposite stance in the April 1836 pamphlet that we put the pin in before. We're going to read from that extensively here in just a second. Joe's anti-slavery stance was purely political and never carried the weight of thus saith the Lord like most of his revelations. And it didn't come until He was running for president in 1844, the year he died. So the appearance of this, 1833 article from Double Dub Phelps, Free People of Color, that caused fire and fury, as it was coupled with rumors of the revelation that later became D&C 87 that, quote, war will be poured out upon all nations beginning at South Carolina. Slaves shall rise up against their masters. The remnants, meaning the Native Americans, will marshal themselves and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation, end quote. Missourians construed that Free People of Color statement with the rumors of this revelation existing as exactly what they needed to consider the Mormons their enemies. So Phelps published a clarifying statement in the next issue of the Evening and the Morning Star, which was an attempt to allay the excitement. From Phelps, quote, "Having learned with extreme regret that an article entitled Free People of Color in the last number of the Star has been misunderstood, we feel in duty bound to stare in this extra that our intention was not only to stop free people of color from emigrating to this state, but to prevent them from being admitted as members of the church. We often," oh man, Phelps, great job. Great job, buddy. Really got your head on straight. "We often lament the situation of our sister states in the South, and we fear lest, as has been the case, that blacks should rise and spill innocent blood." The innocent blood of the people who own them as property? Really? That's the case you're going to make? "For they are ignorant, and a little may lead them to disturb the peace of society," the society that was built on their broken backs. To be short, we are opposed to having free people of color admitted into the state of Missouri, and we say that none will be admitted into the church, end quote. Look, this was the racism issue of the day. This was the bigotry issue of the day, right? The leadership of the church, especially Joseph Smith, they had an opportunity to stick to the Book of Mormon and oppose slavery and to invite African Americans to join their church. They could have been on the right side of history and taken the moral stance on the hottest moral and political issue of the day. Instead, they prohibited black people from joining the church in order to appease the slaveholders. And even with this tacit approval of slavery and then, the prohibition of slaves from joining the church or even immigrating to the state of Missouri, the Missourian public sentiment against the church had already been adjudicated in the court of public opinion, and the Mormons had to go from Jackson County. Now, one may be tempted to say that these were the public statements of W. Phelps as editor of the church's periodical and therefore don't reflect Joe's personal beliefs on the question of slavery and racism. Well, let's talk about Joe's 1836 letter, pamphlet letter, I don't know what you want to call it. So what spawned this was, all the tensions that were happening in Missouri, the Mormons resettling to Caldwell County, and an abolitionist that visited Kirtland, Ohio, a non-slave state in 1836, and this reveals Joe's lethargy toward the slave question, and that lethargy would no longer suffice. He had to take a stand on the slave issue. So Joe sent a letter to the editor of the Kirtland-based Messenger and Advocate, who was Oliver Cowdery at the time. Joe's letter details that the abolitionist who preached in Kirtland was mostly ignored and, quote, attended to their own avocations and left the gentleman to hold forth his own arguments to nearly naked walls, end quote. Mormons just ignoring the pressing social issues of their day, or being on the wrong side of them. It's a long tradition that apparently started way back in Kirtland. So Joe, in his 1836 April pamphlet, goes on to lament how much members bicker over the question of slavery and attempt to withdraw fellowship from those who join the church but hold slaves. He's saddened that people will join the cry of abolition and, quote, set loose upon the world a community of people, freed slaves, who might peradventure overrun our country and violate the most sacred principles of human society. End quote. You can't trust slaves to free themselves, or they might overrun the entire nation and violate society as we know it. Wouldn't that just be a shame for white society to endure in the 1830s? The white society that brought all of those people over from Africa against their will and subjected them to, a couple centuries of the most horrific and disgusting abuse, treating them as beasts of burden. And, we wouldn't want to upset the good order of, colonialistic American white society, would we? But then Joe goes to, deal the killing blow with this quote. It may, no doubt, with propriety be said that many who hold slaves live without the fear of God before their eyes. And the same may be said of many in the free states. Then who is to be the judge in this matter? Now he's speaking of abolitionists. Why not cease their clamor and no further urge the slave to acts of murder and the masters to vigorous discipline, rendering both miserable? I do not believe that the people of the North have any more right to say the South shall not hold slaves than the South have to say the North shall. End quote. Joseph Smith was pro-states' rights during the burgeoning abolitionist movement. This is being pro-fascism or pro-eugenics in the 1930s, like President Heber J. Grant giving a talk in Frankfurt with the Nazi flag behind him in 1937, right? This is a clear, that really happened, that Heber J. Grant gave a talk in Frankfurt with the Nazi flag behind him in 1937. I'm serious, that really happened. Like, this was a clear example of Joe simply being on the wrong side of history, and more importantly, on the wrong side of human morality. Like, releasing this statement was an act of pacification to not infuriate the Missourians against the growing number of Mormons in their state. And this is so infuriating to yours truly, right? Joseph Smith was supposed to be the paragon of morality. He had God on speed dial and claimed that he could see the future. But when it came to one of the most basic questions of human morality, nay, human decency, he abdicated his place as the moral high point of humanity and then sided with the people who own other people as property. What the hell good is a prophet of God if he tells us to violate the very essence of what makes us human, autonomy and freedom of choice? On the slave question, Joseph Smith was an anchor holding the boat of human morality underwater during a hurricane at high tide. But Joe didn't stop there. If he did, it would be absolutely barbaric and just, clearly opportunistic, right? But he had plenty more to say on the slave issue. He went on to recite the same Bible passages used by pro-slavery advocates, quoting Genesis and quoting Paul. He then trots out the white supremacy of the curse of Cain that's so eloquently captured in his own books of Mormon, Moses, and the soon-to-be-written Book of Abraham. Quote, what could have been the design of the Almighty in this wonderful occurrence? This wonderful occurrence of slavery? He calls it a wonderful occurrence. Can somebody meme that and put it on the ex-Mormon subreddit or something? Joseph Smith, what could have been the design of the Almighty in this wonderful occurrence is not for me to say in regards to slavery. But I can say that the curse is not yet taken off the sons of Canaan. Neither will it be until it is affected by as great power as caused it to come. And that the people who interfere the least with the decrees and purposes of God in this matter will come under the least condemnation before him. And those who are determined to pursue a course which shows an opposition against the designs of the Lord, meaning slavery, will learn that God can do his own work without the aid of those who are not dictated by his counsel. End quote. To summarize, those who interfere with slavery are going against God's will and are under condemnation before him. The curse of Cain will not be lifted until some calamitous event that removes the curse of dark skin equal with the same power that gave them the dark skin to begin with. There's so much nasty bigotry wrapped up into that line of logic. And that's the thing is, Joseph Smith was a raging white supremacist. And I recently gave a presentation to the UK group Skeptics in the Pub about Mormonism and white supremacy in the eugenics experiment that it has been. And I cited all of Joe's relevant revelations on the subject. Look, Joseph Smith wasn't just a racist. He was a white supremacist. May that statement never fall on deaf ears. Joseph Smith was a white supremacist, and any claim to the contrary is factually wrong. Joseph Smith saw white skin as pure and delightsome, while dark skin was the curse of Cain, to make the people loathsome unto the chosen people. He spoke officially as the prophet of God in an official church periodical, quoted extensively from the Bible to justify slavery. And he said that anybody opposing slavery is under condemnation from God. Joseph Smith wasn't just a racist. He was a white supremacist. He wasn't even a progressive of his day on the issue of slavery. He was a weather vane going with the political wind of the day. This guy speaks for God, meaning that his God must be incontrovertibly a white supremacist. If you believe that Joe was a prophet, why is the God that he supposedly received direction from worthy of worship? Why should we support a white supremacist God? The curse that Joe claimed has never been lifted in Mormon theology. Like, black men can have the priesthood as of 1978, but the curse is still very much alive and well in white supremacist Mormon scripture. Now, people will quote Joe's presidential campaign pamphlet, which advocated for the release of slaves and a huge government bailout for the slaveholders, and say that that is evidence of Joe being on the right side of the slavery issue. They're wrong. They're just wrong. As a prophet of God, he used the Bible to claim slavery was the way that God created the world. As a president of the United States candidate, he didn't use the Bible to justify abolition, in spite of the many Christian abolitionists who did as his contemporaries. He was pro-abolition as a POTUS candidate because his enemies were the Southern Democrats. He wanted to own the libs after the Missouri Mormon War, right? Joe had many chances, over a decade and a half of chances, to issue new revelation that slavery was evil. He could have taken the actual moral stance on the greatest social justice issue of his day, but he didn't. He only switched to abolitionism because it was politically advantageous. And more importantly, he never quoted God when he switched to being an abolitionist, right? Which that is the absolute laziest and morally bankrupt system by which to determine one's morals, whatever is politically advantageous, right? What is he, Mitt Romney, right? Like, if your morals are determined based on what will get you elected, you're a spineless coward. You are lazy. Joe was the worst kind of white supremacist, the lazy religious kind, which, if I'm being honest, is like the majority of white supremacists. Episode 165. And I want to dwell on this point for a minute longer, at risk of belaboring the point, but it is so incredibly crucial, and it's possibly like the most important takeaway from today's episode, right? The Mormons were largely Northerners who either opposed to or were indifferent towards slavery. Joe's 1836 letter to the editor, Oliver Cowdery, published in an official church periodical, illustrates an aspect of Joe's inert mentality towards social ills of his day. In slaveholding America, not having an opinion on the issue of slavery was the same as having an opinion on it. Joe took the states' rights side of the issue. He was not only on the wrong side of history by taking this pro-slavery stance, he was on the wrong side of humanity. And what was it that garnered this letter being written in the first place? Political pressure from pro-slavery Missouri and an abolitionist coming and speaking to blank walls in Kirtland. Like, Joe didn't want to inflame tensions with slaveholders any more than the Mormons had in the previous 5 years before he got to Missouri. So he published this rant about how awesome and divinely ordained slavery is because he was afraid of what the Missourians might do to the Mormons. This isn't just lazy, it's deplorable. And believers will often claim that Joe was an abolitionist because his 1844 campaign pamphlet But that underscores the point that he flip-flopped on the question of slavery only when he thought it would get him more votes. Like, Joseph Smith used the same Bible passages that slave owners used to justify owning their slaves, to say that slavery was commanded by God, not only allowed, but commanded. He adopted the political stance of the Confederacy nearly 20 years before it existed. Like, if there was a single issue where Joe could prophesy of the future and take the right side of a moral issue in the 1830s and 40s, slavery was that single issue. To be a states' rights person in the 1830s, it's the same as separate but equal prior to the end of segregation. He was just on the wrong side of history while simultaneously claiming to be the mouthpiece of an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. This example alone casts into question the stance of the church on every social justice issue during its existence, right? Bloody Brigham Young fought for Utah to be a slave territory barely a decade before the Civil War, right? Today's leaders are viciously opposed to LGBTQ plus rights, keeping with the same trend of lethargy towards the often unpopular but moral stance on social issues. And granted, abolishing slavery and legalizing gay marriage, they're far from the same thing, but opposition to them comes from the same religiously bigoted place, and Joe was no moral stalwart of his day, in spite of the near deification his legacy enjoys in the church today. He was as slothful as any politician seeking popular approval, garnering support by playing into instead of against people's basest fears and prejudices. Not only was Joe's work ethic lazy, but his own morality was lazy. This single data point really highlights the way that I opened this episode. I mean, a person operating from a moral compass given to them by divine decree will always be morally inferior to somebody who puts the work into shaping their own moral compass from consequential ethicism and other categories of philosophical morality. The cult leader and follower may be the most active and industrious person you meet, but at the end of the day, their minds have atrophied from lack of use and critical examination of the world around them. Any way you examine Joseph Smith, from his moral ethics to his business practices to his general work ethic, he was the epitome of lazy. I had to get that off my chest. I could spend an entire episode on just this issue of Joseph Smith's stance on slavery, but we must soldier forth. Now, in spite of being pro-slavery when Joe fled, Kirtland for Missouri, tensions eventually climaxed between the Mormons and the anti-Mormon Missourians throughout the year of 1838. They only boiled over when Joe got there and he started violating all their treaties. Now, one of the big things that kicked off the Missouri-Mormon War was Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon's militant preaching. Now, Mormons always talk about the extermination order that the governor of Missouri, Lilburn Boggs, issued, but it was actually Sidney Rigdon who first used the word extermination in Missouri. On the 4th of July in 1838, he gave a sermon which has become infamous in Mormon history. I called it the Red Sermon back on episode 43 because in many ways, it was one of the primary catalysts for the impending Missouri-Mormon War. Quote, "And that mob that comes on us to disturb us, it shall be between us and them," us versus them mentality, "a war of extermination. For we will follow them till the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. For we will carry the seat of war to their own houses and their own families, and one party or the other shall be utterly destroyed." End quote. Not only threatening people, but threatening their slaveholding livelihoods in society and threatening their homes and their families. Why didn't the Missourians like the Mormons again? I mean, if Joe really had the insight of a prophet, let's say, he could have stood up right after Rigdon's sermon and said something to calm the crowd down and correct what Rigdon has just said. Instead, Joe got up and endorsed Hinchpin Rigdon's message. Now, Joe's failure to rein in Rigdon was at best incompetent. When his people were on the precipice of civil war, he let his second-in-command take control of the church and influence his decisions, which caused the Hansville massacre and the suffering of thousands of Mormons during the expulsion from the state. Like, Joe could have stepped in at any time. He could have denounced the more radical members of the leadership, like the Wild Ram of the Mountains, Lyman Wyatt, or Captain Fear Not David W. Patton, or Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon, right? Instead, Joe let his people spiral out of control through inaction and incompetence. But all of this is true only if we believe the apologist narrative of the Missouri Mormon War. On the other hand, I tend to believe Joe was among the radicals, and he fed into the fire and fury, which caused that spiraling out of control, which led to so much suffering for the Mormons. Now, on a similar note, there was a Mormon paramilitary organization called the Danites, and we talk about them a lot on the show. They bullied members into conformity. They harassed elected officials and forced them to sign documents under arrest. They even murdered dissenters of the faith, right? Like, Joe later blamed the Danites on Samson Avar during the November Court of Inquiry, and he claimed that he himself had no idea of all the nasty things that the Danites were up to. But this, however, was only after Dr. Samson Avard had defected during the height of the Missouri Mormon War and filed affidavits about the existence of the Danites, which led to the Mormon extermination order by Governor Boggs. I don't buy Joe's deflections and casting blame on Samson Avard for a second in this. Episodes 44, 45, 46, 47, and 48. Even if we look at the massacre at Haun's Mill itself, like Joe's incompetence and inaction coupled with his fire and brimstone speeches throughout 1838, led to the deaths of 18 Mormons. There was a small Mormon community that was, built around a mill that was owned by a guy named Jacob Hahn. The community was attacked by a group of rogue Missouri militia soldiers, and the soldiers massacred the Mormons, including women and children. They mutilated some of the bodies. It was horrible. And perhaps the worst moment of the massacre, as described by historian Stephen LeSueur, quote, "The Missourians found 10-year-old Sardius Smith hiding under the blacksmith's bellows. Young Smith, whose father lay mortally wounded on the floor, begged for his life, but William Reynolds of Livingston County put a gun to the boy's head and blew off the top. 'Nits will make lice, and if he had lived, he would have become a Mormon,' Reynolds reportedly said in justification of his act." End quote. It was a heinous crime, and it was a brutal human tragedy, and it all happened because of Joe's actions or lack thereof. And simply put, like, prior to the Huntsville massacre would have been a great time for Joe to use his powers of magic prophecy to know the situation before it occurred. And Joe did warn, I don't want to sell him short, right? Joe did warn the people of Haun's Mill that they might be in danger because they were furthest away from the Mormon settlement, from the twin city headquarters of Far West and Adamon-Diamond. But they were needed there. But so instead of calling for them to flee to Far West, where they would be under the protection of the church's, headquarters city, Joe told the people at Haun's Mill to use their own judgment and do whatever they thought best. Thus we see the failing of prophecy. Prophets seem to know everything concerning God's will and how to best fulfill it and how much money you need to give them. But when it comes to useful knowledge like how to save the lives of 18 of his parishioners, God simply forgot to mention it to Joseph. And Joe failed to do enough to take a stand, to warn, and to protect his followers. Episode 48 is the Hansville Massacre, but you better be emotionally prepared because that's a heavy episode. After the Missouri Mormon War and the leadership surrendered, episodes 49 and 50, the Mormons left the state of Missouri and they sought refuge in nearby Illinois. Now, this move was largely organized by Uncle John Smith and the Quorum of Apostles under the direction of Bloody Brigham Young. Joe languished in prison for months while the mess that he created was sorted out by his closest advisors, episodes 51, 52, and 53. In order to build Nauvoo, Joe had to become enterprising, and he amassed a lot of responsibility for himself, although none of his responsibilities, oddly, ever involved physical labor. It's amazing. Most of his time was devoted to just riding around areas to scope out land to purchase and then signing his name on contracts. Joe incurred somewhere in the ballpark of $200,000 in personal debt signing all these contracts. That's over $6 million in 2020 money. And then Joe turned around and attempted to sell the land to the destitute refugee Mormons at exorbitant rates, or he would simply give them away, particularly the choice lots, as gifts when people followed his commands or did something special or kind for him, or they, gave him a treat of some kind, or gave him their wife. Like, it takes a special kind of monster to force thousands of people into destitution by committing high treason against the United States and then attempt to make profit off their misery. However, because the Mormons were so destitute, they dealt with, crazy pandemic outbreaks in the Mormon settlements and stuff too. Joe said that it would just disappear if they were faithful enough, and then he caught the sickness. It's really amazing. Because the Mormons were so destitute, once the bills started coming due, Joe couldn't even afford to pay the interest. And drastic measures were needed in order to settle this whole Mormon cash flow problem, as it would be years before the Mormons could build the manufacturing infrastructure in order to benefit from their location on the Mississippi River, which was, it was the largest shipping river in America at the time. So instead of committing to hard work, balancing budgets, and sustainably building Nauvoo, Joe went to Washington, D.C. with hand extended for a government bailout. Now, I'm going to say here, I'm not opposed to reparations, especially when they're justified, right? And in fact, I think that the government's failure to do anything to help the Mormons here was a moral failure. My problem is more with the extremely one-sided picture that Joe painted of what happened in Missouri and the enormous $1.2 million sum that he asked for, including $100,000 for himself and another $100,000 for Hiram, his older brother, Hiram's sidekick, Abiff Smith. In total, Joe asked for over $41 million in 2020 money from the federal government in order to pay reparations for the suffering of about 5,000 to 8,000 people. Reparations, when they are justified, awesome. The government should have to pay out when it messes things up and causes pain and suffering on people and causes humanitarian crises. It should. But this is a step so far beyond what is reasonable or charitable. And the request for reparations, because it was it was just an insane amount of money. It was so an absurdly massive amount of money. And of course, it was designed to pay all of the debts that Joe had racked up. I'm speculating on real estate in Iowa and Illinois. If the government had paid the reparations, instead of just denying them at the front door, right? If it had actually paid reparations, I'm not sure that the actual victims of the Mormon War would see very much of that huge chunk of money. $41 million in 2020 money, right? There's a good chance that Joe would have arranged for most of this money to just enrich himself and the church if the government had paid it out. Episodes 58 and 61. This wasn't the last time that Joe cravenly exploited the suffering of his followers in Missouri in an attempt to get outside help. In fact, it became one of his kind of go-to mantras about the suffering that happened in Missouri. He continued to use the trauma inflicted on the Mormons at that time to help garner and to manufacture a very compelling persecution narrative. But Joe also called upon the Green Mountain Boys militia of Vermont to join the Nauvoo Legion to both put down the anti-Mormon violence in Illinois that was cropping up at the time, it was 1843, and also to help him make Missouri pay for its persecution of the Mormons. Now remember, after committing high treason against the United States and being locked in jail for a number of charges, right? Joe was dead to rights in Missouri. The state government had him on arson, robbery, high treason, and murder. So Joe couldn't step foot in the state of Missouri without his own militia, or he'd be arrested and hung immediately. He thought that if he could just burn the whole state to the ground, he wouldn't have to deal with the Missouri problem anymore, to make them pay. The Nauvoo Legion wasn't big enough yet to wage a full-on war without sustaining a bunch of casualties, but he thought if the Green Mountain Boys agreed to join forces to raze the state, R-A-Z-E, raze it to the ground, right, he'd lose a lot less of his own Nauvoo Legion militia. In his letter to the Green Mountain Boys, and it was an open letter, it was published in the Times and Seasons, Joe pulls all the strings of emotional manipulation, and he is blatantly dishonest, just outright lying about what happened in Missouri and many other aspects. He begins by telling the Green Mountain Boys that he's a Vermonter himself and a faithful American citizen. So one truth and one very complicated lie. Then he launches into, like, can somebody who's committed high treason and raised their own rebel militia in a state be considered a faithful American citizen? I don't know. Maybe reasonable people can disagree about that. Anyway, after that, Joe launches into his tale of persecution in Missouri, including the blatant lie that, quote, 12 or 15,000 innocent inhabitants were murdered and hundreds expelled. The residue at the point of the bayonet without law, contrary to the express language of the Constitution of the United States and every state in the Union, and contrary to the custom and usage of civilized nations, and especially one holding up the motto, the asylum of the oppressed, end quote. So, okay, hundreds expelled at the point of a bayonet, that's true. But, quote, 12 or 15,000 innocent inhabitants were murdered, end quote. Are you kidding? The actual casualty count was about 21 people on the Mormon side and a very small handful of Missourians. 12 to 15,000 inhabitants were murdered? Really? Now, I can't help but wonder if this is an example of Joe's Yankee wit, where he would, say something that's technically true, but then deliberately designed to be misunderstood. Like, lying resides in the intent, even if the statement may be true. If you say something that is crafted in a specific way that is intent on deluding somebody, then that's lying, even if the statement itself is true, right? Here's an example of Joe's Yankee wit, right? Joe's New York neighbor, Peter Ingersoll, after he went and was headed out to Harmony, Pennsylvania. This was before Joe got his, tongue lashing from Isaac Hale, right? Peter Ingersoll says, quote, Joe once told a toll collector that he didn't have money to pay the toll, so that he'd hand him double on the way back. So the toll collector agreed to this deal, and on the way back, Joe did hand him the double toll, but the toll collector didn't recognize Joe, so the toll collector gave Joe back half the amount as change. So afterwards, Peter Ingersoll asked Joe, didn't you promise to pay double on the way back? And then Joe said, no, quote, I promised to hand him double, end quote, which he handed back the change, right? This was technically true, but the intent was to mislead. The intent was a lie in order to, skirt over a toll road. That's theft. That's robbery, right? Now apply the same logic to this letter to the Green Mountain Boys, right? Joe says 12 or 15,000 people were murdered in Missouri. It sounds like he's saying that between 12,000 people and 15,000 people were murdered in Missouri. But you could also interpret this statement to be saying that between 12 people and 15,000 people were murdered in Missouri. Like, even if the words are technically true, if it is said with an intent to delude somebody, it is a lie. We're living in the greatest economy we've ever had in the world right now, right? And Joe loved these kind of word games, right? It would not at all surprise me if that was what went through his mind when he wrote this claim to the Green Mountain Boys, right? Then he goes on to the objective of the expedition that he was asking for their help with. Quote, with all these facts before me and a pure desire to ameliorate the condition of the poor and unfortunate among men, and if possible to entice all men from evil to good, and with firm reliance that God will reward the just, I have been stimulated to call upon my native state for a union of all honest men, and to appeal to the valor of the Green Mountain Boys by all honorable methods and means to assist me in obtaining justice from Missouri. There's so much manipulation in here, right? Not only for the property she has stolen and confiscated, the murders she has committed among my friends, and for our expulsion from the state, but also to humble and chastise or abase her for the disgrace she has brought upon constitutional liberty until she atones for her sins, end quote. Joe wanted revenge for what happened in Missouri, right? And Missouri, in so many ways, like, it's understandable that he wanted revenge because it was an embarrassment to him. He looked like an absolute nincompoop when it came to his conduct in Missouri. And for all of the hubbub and bluster about him being a warlord, a Moses of the Mormons, somebody to lead a religious revolution in America, to just surrender before any battle really happened, like, it was an embarrassment. He should have and did justifiably feel embarrassed for his own conduct. But like this also, like, he wanted revenge, but this also played into his larger plans to unify freed slaves and oppressed natives into his Nauvoo Legion in order to overthrow the United States government and instate his Mormon theocracy. So if he could get these Green Mountain Boys to start the fight for him and then take the brunt of the opening casualties beginning in Missouri, that was obviously preferable to, preferable option to the American Muhammad instead of, all of his Nauvoo Legionnaires going in there and getting slaughtered, right? So then Joe goes on to manipulate the Green Mountain Boys with just a huge gish gallop of noble sounding lies. He claims that his father served in several battles of the American Revolution when he was 5 years old, apparently. And then he had to watch his comrades in arms shot dead in Missouri. He claims his brother Don Carlos died of exposure and fatigue when, in fact, Don Carlos died because he was working in a dark and mildew-filled basement just churning out propaganda for the church as editor of the Times and Seasons, not because of anything that he actually suffered during the exodus to Illinois. Or maybe he was just opposed to polygamy and he needed to be put out of the way. It's not really clear. Joe also claims that his mother has permanent problems from the trauma, which, that's fair. Like, all the Mormons had experienced the trauma from what happened in Missouri, all because of Joe's decisions, right? And he also claims that the Missouri jailers tried to feed him human flesh, which there's no evidence of. But the whole point of his letter is to weave a persecution narrative. And we can't let all of those pesky facts get in the way of good propaganda now, can we? Like, facts weren't in the cards because Joe was a parasite, right? He could only survive by attaching to others and sucking them dry like a leech. Episode 181. Now, an aspect of Joe's character that bears examination here is his dictatorial tendencies. Like, rarely did he write anything. Instead, he dictated it. Rarely did he fix problems himself. He delegated problems to be solved by others. He rarely wrote his own propaganda for the church. He had a team of propaganda, can we say ministers, tasked with spewing constant twisted truths from the Nauvoo printer's mill, right? Like, he didn't even write his own presidential campaign pamphlet. Like, that's something that he should have been the foremost expert on. He instead had it ghostwritten by Double Dub Phelps, right? If a task needed to be completed, Joe dictated it to somebody who considered him the prophet of God. And whatever he said, well, that's the will of the Lord. Notably as well, like, when problems cropped up, he was far more likely to run away from the problems than confront them or go ask the government for a huge bailout, right? He was not only a coward, but a lazy coward. Like, these are traits of a, good CEO that deserves respect for what they build, right? Like, but Joe didn't build anything himself, and therefore he doesn't deserve any respect. The force of his will wasn't do this thing because it's what the company needs. Joe's modus operandi was do this thing because God commands you to do it. And you wouldn't question the mind and will of the Lord on this, would you? That kind of conduct, that's not respectable. It's pathetic. And as a microcosm of these traits, I offer the Nauvoo expositor issue as a prime example, right? Like, William Law formed his own church in the city of Nauvoo. He called the leadership in Nauvoo to repentance, called for reformation in the church. Like, the Nauvoo expositor was William Law's 95 thesis, right? And then he published the scathing expose known as the Nauvoo expositor with 6 co-printers and an editor. Joe claimed that the paper was full of slander and libel. The right thing to do in this would be to sue the printers and get an injunction against them printing more issues until the case was settled or a verdict was reached. However, if Joe sued the printers, that would require discovery, and that would reveal the extent to which the expositor's claims were slanderous or actually true. And because the printers were very careful about what they published, Joe knew that it was full of truths and that he would lose the slander lawsuit. Truth is an absolute defense in slander cases, and Joe wouldn't survive an impartial hearing. That would result in his church being tossed into chaos as the popular media ran stories about the hearings and all the statements from the witnesses, which proved that polygamy was going on and that the Mormon Empire was amassing way too much political wealth and, thereby infringing on the separation of church and state. So instead of going through all of the time and effort of these legal troubles and waging multiple campaigns of character assassination against the printers, taking years to do it, Joe just took the easy way out and, like a tyrant, ordered the press destroyed, which then led to his eventual arrest and vigilante execution, right? Episode 200. The church the expositor printers formed posed an existential threat to Joe's church. And in a jealous bid for power, he instead took a scorched earth approach to the dissenters and audaciously thought himself untouchable in such a criminal act. And a lot of that was spurned because Joe's gluttony for women was something that he had to lie about and silence any threat of public exposure, right? Which that proved to be his ultimate downfall. It's, to try and capture the thesis here, describing Joseph Smith is very tough, but indolent and work shy for any task which couldn't be delegated to one of his lackeys, right? Shiftless and inert in his own morals, stating whatever was popular that would gain him more followers and more retweets, right? Torpid when his people needed him the most as refugees, sick and dying in the swampland on the banks of the Mississippi, loafing about and asking for huge government bailouts instead of working to pay his debts and learning how to balance a budget. Utterly apathetic to establish a hardline stance on basic issues of morality, like whether or not it's okay to own humans as property. Careless and neglectful about the suffering of his own followers and indifferent about the plights of those oppressed by colonialism and the slaveholding society, and privileged and resting on the laurels of a white supremacist nation. He held absolute contempt for the rule of law by which society abides in lieu of simply doing whatever he wanted. Joseph Smith was a lazy man. And he built cities. He wrote books. He was the editor of multiple newspapers. He formed his own armies. He ran hundreds of businesses throughout his life. Seldom had any time to help raise his kids because each day was occupied with founding a religion. He fought a war. He started a university. He wrote multiple books of scripture. He was a father and a husband and a husband and a husband and a husband and a husband. He fought dissenters. Are these the attributes of a lazy man? Yes. Yes, they are. The entire premise of this episode has been that people can be physically industrious and busy every waking moment of every day, but remain the laziest parasites of society. Simultaneously, a person who thinks about the world in which they live, they deal with the hardest questions that face our shared human existence. What's the purpose of life? What's the most moral outcome of a given situation? How do I reduce suffering in the world? How does one person make the world a better place for the most people? The person who ponders these questions, spending their life consuming information, never hammering a nail, never milking a cow, never plumbing a house, never doing any housework, those people can be the most ambitious and energetic human beings alive. A cult leader or a follower are the most active, lazy people around. A philosopher is the least active, hard worker society can offer. The efforts of one contribute only to the maintenance and expansion of an exclusive and oftentimes bigoted group. The efforts of the other contribute to the betterment of humanity. A cult leader like Joseph Smith, right? He thrives on lies being accepted without critical examination, spread through intellectual contagion to those without an intellectual immune system is equipped to evaluate those lies. A skeptic, a critical thinker, a scientist, a philosopher, this person thrives on gathering more information and never ceasing that quest. A cult leader's job is complete when a person gives their life to the cult. A philosopher's job is complete when they realize their job is never complete. When the prophet speaks, the thinking has been done. When a scientist speaks, the thinking is perpetuated. When a cult leader is wrong about something, the adversary's grasp on the world is more realized. When a philosopher is wrong about something, they realize the issue is more complex than they initially thought, and their thoughts grow and adapt to understand that information in a broader context. For the cult leader, the world is always what they know. For a scientist, the world is comprised of unknown unknowns. The cult leader is moved by arrogance and limited information. The philosopher is moved by humility and expanding information. One can only exist by virtue of people's intellectual idleness. The other's existence is solely devoted to tirelessly ridding people of their intellectual idleness. From treasure digging to petitioning the government for a $41 million bailout, Joe's entire life was marked by the easiest path. He walked the trail blazed by cult leaders for millennia before him, and once he was believed to be a prophet of God, he lived a life of luxury from the manipulated sacrifices of his devotees. There are always more stories from early Mormonism to learn from, but 30 pages of script for today, that's enough. I'm exhausted. I'm gonna go take a nap. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres and the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.